Hello, I'm Michelle, your librarian and storyteller for this evening. It's St. Patrick's Day, but before I start with stories, I have a disclaimer. I am not Irish. I don't have a single drop of Irish blood. Any accent or pronunciation is purely accidental. Now, that being said, I do really enjoy tales of mischief and mayhem and trickery, and we've got a few of those tales for you tonight. This is Irish Tales and Bawdy Yarns. Welcome to Storytime for Grown-Ups. I'm putting on my Irish hat because this first one is an Irish story. I love the stories where the little one or the simpleton fools the other people who think they can put one over on them. There's so many good stories like that. And this one is going to be our story today. Hudden, Dudden, and Donald O'Neary. Here we go. Once upon a time, a farmer named Donald O'Neary lived in a tiny strip of land between two large prosperous farms. He owned a skinny cow named Daisy, and that was all. The rich farmers were named Hudden and Dudden, and they owned goats and sheep and cattle and plenty of land. Now you might think that Hudden and Dudden would be happy with all that they had. Well, no, of course not. They were greedy men. Each night Hudden and Dudden lay in bed thinking of ways to take away poor Donald O'Neary's strip of land. At last, they poisoned Daisy, for they thought that if Donald lost Daisy, he would move away. These are particularly horrible antagonists in this. When Donald saw Daisy had died, he was sad, but he was no fool. Well, he said to himself, she's better off the way she is. She was always starving. The next market day, he carried Daisy's hide to the village. Just before he reached the market, he cut a few slits in the hide, and in these slits he placed every penny he owned. There were only a few. In the village, Donald went to the finest inn and hung the hide upon the wall. Bring me your best food, and don't fear I won't be paying you. Just look here. Donald called to the innkeeper. He tapped Daisy's hide with his stick, and out hopped a penny. You see, this hide of mine gives me all the money I want. You can imagine the innkeeper's surprise. What do you take for that hide? He asked. It's not for sale. It's kept me and mine for years. Donald tapped again, and out fell a second penny. The innkeeper begged and pleaded. At last Donald sold the hide and walked directly to his neighbor Hudden's house. Evening, Hudden. I want to borrow your scale to weigh my gold, he said. Hudden couldn't believe his ears. Donald O'Neary with gold? But anyway, first he smeared the scale with butter. Then he loaned it to Donald. Tricks, tricks, tricks. Back home, Donald began to weigh the gold the innkeeper had paid him. When he returned the scale, a piece of gold was stuck to the butter. Well, if Hudden was surprised before, he was more surprised now. He ran to Dudden's place and told the whole tale. He must have thousands. So they ran to Donald's door. Evening, Hudden. Evening, Dudden, Donald said. Ah, you've done me a fine deed destroying my Daisy. Hides are worth their weight in gold these days. The next day at dawn, Hudden and Dudden took a dozen hides of their own to market. Hides to sell, they called. They'll cost their weight in gold. No one wanted hides that cost so much. When the innkeeper heard their claim, he was sure it was they who had cheated him the day before. He had tapped Daisy's hide 1,000 times, and not a single penny came out of that hide. He was furious, for he had paid for that hide in its weight in gold. So The innkeeper chased Hudden and Dudden, calling out, "Catch those thieves!" Hudden and Dudden ran and ran, and when they came to Donald O'Neary, Hudden cried, "Catch 'em!" They grabbed Donald and thrust him inside a big meal sack. They tied up that sack tight and started off for Brown Lake of the Bog. They planned to throw him in. The place was far, and Hudden and Dudden were wary, so when they came to an inn by the roadside, they stopped to take a rest. They left the sack by the door of the inn, pretending it was just a big sack of potatoes. "Be still," they warned Donald. Soon Hudden and Dudden were inside, singing, imagining how happy they would be when Donald O'Neary was down at the bottom of the Brown Lake of the Bog. But here we go. When Donald heard a farmer driving his cattle past his sack, he cried out, "I won't have her, I tell you." "And who won't you have?" the farmer asked the talking sack. "They're forcing me to marry the king's daughter. Imagine that. Oh, sure, she's rich and beautiful, but I don't love her. Please help me escape." The farmer let Donald out, and he took his place, for he didn't mind the idea of marrying the king's daughter. There is some moral ambiguity in this story, just so you know. "Take my herd of cattle in exchange," the farmer said to Donald. "Now lie still," Donald said. "And remember, they'll treat you like a vagabond because they'll think you're me and you don't want the king's pretty daughter." When Hudden and Dudden came out, they pulled the sack to the lake and pitched it in and went home lightheartedly. No sooner had they arrived home when they saw Donald O'Neary surrounded by a herd of cows. Hudden stared. Dudden gasped. Donald shook their hands and said, "Thank you. You knew Brown Lake leads to a land so full of fat cattle, I had to struggle to bring them up in this bunch." So Dudden and Hudden ran right back to the lake and jumped in. But they never came back. Maybe they grew too fat, like the cattle down deep in Brown Lake, and they couldn't swim up to the top. But as for Donald O'Neary, he worked the land and took good care of his cattle all the rest of his days, and he lived very happily. The end. I have to have a sheet of notes for this one because this is the tale of Grace O'Malley, pirate queen, warrior, legend. And there are way too many stories about her for me to keep straight in my head. I got a lot of this information from Ben Thompson's blog, Badass of the Week. And if you like badasses, we do have this great book of his in the library, Badass, The Birth of a Legend. And it covers pretty much all legendary people from Samson, Sinbad, all the way to Sauron and Darth Vader. It's also often on my staff picks. But we're not going to read from this. We're going to read from this and this. Grace O'Malley. This is a true story. I will read this bit from Ben's blog about Grace O'Malley because it's so well said. "This estro-genocidal ginger gunslinger raided shipping vessels, battled English armies, conquered castles from rival Irish clans, and once traveled to London just so she could talk shit to Queen Elizabeth in person." So here is the story of Grace O'Malley. She was born in around 1530 as Grania Nimale. I'm going to stick with Grace O'Malley because I don't want to slaughter the language at all. This is around the time is the end of the Italian Renaissance. King Henry VIII is the King of England, probably halfway through his wives at this point. So Grace's father was a very well-to-do sea merchant. He had a lot of trade routes and also would charge fishermen tariffs. When she was a teenager, she begged to go on the ships with him. And to get her to stop, he just said, "No, girls can't go on ships. Your hair is going to get caught in the rigging." So the next day he gets to his boat and he sees his daughter. She has chopped off all her hair and is ready to go. So he couldn't really refuse her. She ended up being his second in command because she was an able seawoman and great leader, could spot storms before they came, like really, really pulled her own weight on the ship. But just because she was fantastic on sea, she was still a 16-year-old girl in the 1500s, so she was married off at 16 to Donald O'Flaherty, who was another wealthy landowner who actually owned a fortress called Cox Castle. Now, Donald was killed in a battle with the Joyce clan. Soon after, Clan Joyce took over Cox Castle, but Grace would have none of it. She gathered up an army, and leading them herself, she attacked the castle, routed out the Joyce clan, and claimed it for her own. It was then known as Hen's Castle, and it is actually known as Hen's Castle to this day. And I found a picture. So this is her fortress. This is Hen's Castle, Grace O'Malley's fortress. Pretty imposing and impressive. All right, back to Grace. So now she's a widow. But, you know, it is the 1500s, so she can't stay a widow for very long. She married Iron Richard Burke for political reasons, certainly not for love. And that marriage lasted a year. And then she decided she had enough. She locked Richard out of the castle, threw all his stuff out, and basically said, Richard, I dismiss you. And Richard went away and was dismissed. So from that point forward, she was basically a one-woman show. She inherited from her husband's and from her father huge swaths of land, all the ships, the merchant business, and she created a pirate kingdom, essentially, on the coast of Ireland. There is a story that she gave birth to her third child while on one of her merchant ships on a trade mission to the Mediterranean. So as she was giving birth, the ship got boarded by Turkish raiders. So she finished giving birth to her child. She got up, she got a gun, and there's also a story too where there was an English earl who refused to let Grace O'Malley in when she showed up at his doorway looking for some supper. So how did she deal with this insult? She actually kidnapped his son and held him for ransom. So the earl made sure to invite her for supper, feed her very, very well, and he kept an extra plate at his table just in case she would come. He kept that plate on there for the rest of his life. And apparently this is still a tradition the family does, is keeping a spare plate at the table for Grace O'Malley. So what is that, 700 years later, 600 years later, she still has such a strong influence. In 1588, one of the warships of the Spanish Armada got lost in a storm, got stuck in the waters controlled by the Sea Queen. Grace O'Malley personally led the attack that captured the war galleon. She was 50 years old. So England started to pay attention to this pirate queen of Ireland. So far, they had just let her do her own thing, but she was costing them money. She was costing them ships. She was inciting rebellion. So there was an attack on Hen's Castle. And this is the description of what happened. Grace held off the attack by pouring hot oil from the roof of the castle onto the attackers, and then by melting down captured armor and plunder and molding it into bullets to fight the British. When the British tried to retreat, their ships were attacked by Grace's pirate ships that were just off the coast. In 1593, they were actually successful in capturing Grace's brother and her sons. And the English governor of Connaught held them for ransom in prison, demanding that Grace surrender. Well, she did not surrender. She actually traveled to London to have audience with Queen Elizabeth. She brought a dagger with her into the royal chamber. It was confiscated. She insulted a courtier by throwing his handkerchief into the fire. And she spoke Latin with Queen Elizabeth. She refused to speak English with her. So the two queens spoke Latin with each other. She also refused to bow and demanded release of her family. So Elizabeth did agree to fire the governor, or recall him to England, and release the prisoners if Grace agreed to stop destabilizing the countryside and stop supporting the rebellions of Irish nobles. So, deal was done. There are so many more stories about her. There are statues of her in Ireland, but she essentially dominated shipping lanes and kept accumulating wealth throughout her entire lifetime. She was never conquered, never defeated, and she died at 73 years old, the same year that Queen Elizabeth I died. Okay, and this is another quote from an Irish historian who did a biography of Grace O'Malley. A fearless leader by land and by sea, a political pragmatist and politician, a ruthless plunderer, a mercenary, a rebel, a shrewd and able negotiator, the protective matriarch of her family and tribe, a genuine inheritor of the mother goddess and warrior queen attributes of her remote ancestors. Above all else, she emerges as a woman who broke the mold and thereby played a unique role in history. So there's a little bit of Irish history for you. A little bit of badassness for this St. Patrick's Day. So I usually end my Irish tales and bawdy yarns by telling 7 Drunken Nights, a traditional song that first came about in about 1760, and today is no exception. So I present to you 7 Drunken Nights with some help from friends. As I went home on a Monday night, as drunk could be, I saw a horse outside my door where my old horse should be. So I called me wife and I said to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns that horse outside our door where my old horse should be?
Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool. Still you cannot see. That's a lovely sow that me mother sent to me.
Well, it's many a day I've travelled 100 miles or more, but a saddle on a sow sure I've never seen before. As I came home on a Tuesday night, as drunk can be, I saw a coat behind the door where my old coat should be. So I called me wife and I says to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns that coat behind the door where my old coat should be?
Ah, you drunk, you silly old fool, still you cannot see. That's a woolen blanket that my mother sent to me.
Well, it's many a day I've travelled 100 miles or more, but buttons on a blanket sure I've never seen before. As I went home on a Wednesday night, as drunk could be, I saw a pipe upon the chair where my old pipe should be. So I called me wife and I said to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns that pipe upon my chair where my old pipe should be?
Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool, still you cannot see. That's a lovely tin whistle that me mother sent to me.
Well, it's many a day I've travelled 100 mile or more, but tobacco in a tin whistle sure I've never seen before. As I went home on a Thursday night, as drunk could be, I saw 2 boots beneath my bed where my old boots should be. So I called me wife and I said to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns those boots beneath the bed where my old boots should be?
Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool. Still you cannot see. They're 2 lovely geranium pots me mother sent to me.
Many a day I've travelled 100 miles or more, but laces in a geranium pot sure I've never seen before. As I came home on a Friday night, as drunk could be, I saw a head upon the bed where my old head should be. So I called me wife and I said to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns that head upon the bed where my old head should be?
Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool, still you cannot see. That's a baby boy that me mother sent to me.
It's many a day I've traveled 100 miles or more, but a baby boy with his whiskers on, sure I've never seen before. As I came home on a Saturday night, as drunk could be, I saw two hands upon her breasts, where my two hands should be. So I called me wife, and I said to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns those hands upon your breasts, where my old hands should be?
Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool. Still you cannot see. That's a lovely nightgown my mother sent to me.
Well, it's many a day I've traveled 100 miles or more, but fingers in a nightgown sure I've never seen before. As I came home on a Sunday night, as drunk could be, I saw a thing in her thing where my old thing should be. So I called me wife, and I said to her, would you kindly tell to me who owns that thing that's in your thing where my old thing should be?
Ah, you're drunk, you silly old fool. Still you cannot see. That's a lovely hammer that me mother sent to me.
Well, it's many a day I've traveled 100 miles or more, but a hammer with a head like that, sure I've never seen before.
Thank you for joining me for Storytime for Grown-Ups. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll see you soon.